Hello. The theory goes that we are live. Welcome. This is our Trinity Q&A. We are here speaking with Eddy Webb of Onyx Publishing and of Pug Steady. And if you can, see, this is what I get for not having enough coffee this morning. My badge still says I'm a story guide. So we're gonna pretend we're gonna role play an interview.
No, it's scripted really well. This should be easy.
Yeah, there you go. So, Eddy, while I'm fixing that, why don't you go ahead and tell the one person watching that might not know who you are a little bit about yourself, your pronouns, what you do, and the role that you play at Onyx Path Publishing. And
No
I'll fix
problem.
my badge.
My name is Eddy Webb. My pronouns are he, him. Um, uh, I'm the in-house developer, one of the in-house developers for Onyx Path Publishing. Although I've been a consultant and a freelancer for Onyx Path Publishing for years, and then before that, I worked at CCP White Wolf. So I've worked with Rich Thomas more or less nonstop since 2007. So we were together for 12 years. And when he went off to form his own company, I was still at TCP at the time. So I helped him from that end with license stuff and running things. I did some Vampire the Masquerade work for him. And then when I um, was laid off after the death of the late lamented World Arts MMO, I went full time. I formed my own company, Puck Steady, and one of my clients immediately was Rich right out of the gate. So I've been involved with Onyx Path in some capacity pretty much from the beginning.
Nice. And so let's talk, I guess, a little bit about how going back to, because we are focused a little bit on Trinity this morning,
Sure.
going back to your White Wolf days.
Mm-hmm.
uh, were you involved with the first edition Trinity Aberrant Adventure, and to what degree at that point?
Not directly. I came in when CCP merged with White Wolf, and CCP is an Icelandic video game company. They're known for putting out the game EVE Online. And one of the things that was discussed pretty early on was they didn't really want to keep promoting when Trinity was what we now call Aeon, but the space game. They didn't want to have two space games simultaneously. There was some interest in possibly doing an Eve tabletop RPG. So Trinity and the attendant games were kind of internally shelved. We were still selling the games through like Drive-Thru RPG and whatnot, but there was really no plans to do anything with them. And that's something that actually got Ian A. Watson and Rich talking right around the time that I came on board. Was Ian had a pitch for how to structure Trinity akin to what was then known as the New World of Darkness, and now Chronicles of Darkness. So having a core book and then attendant books on top of it. He had a plan that he ran by Rich. And Rich was like, it's a really cool idea. Let me sit on that. Let me get back to you when I can. Because he knew that CCP was not interested in necessarily moving forward with anything, but he was really intrigued about the idea. Then Rich in 2011 goes off to form Onyx Path Publishing, and part of the transition was he bought the rights to Trinity. Because again, CCP had no plans to do anything with it. So Rich is like, well, then if you're not doing anything with it, let me just buy it off you, give you some money, I'll take it under control, and I could do something with it because it's not conflict for me. And that would, along with Scion and half stake in Stuttgart Lands and a couple of other things. So then Rich went to Ian and said, hey, remember the idea you had? Let's talk about that. So that led to some initial development of Story Path system. I was still consulting and primarily focused on Vampire the Masquerade at that time. But I did give some initial thoughts and advice, particularly when Story Path development transitioned to Neil Raymond Price. And the goal of Story Path was to make a game that would work for both Scion and Trinity, which wanted to have one house system that worked for both. And so at that time, I did kind of step in and say, okay, I see where this game is going. Rich needed someone who had some design experience to be able to say, okay, translate Rich's high-level goals into something that another designer can then take and work with. So Rich's like, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And I say, cool, okay, this is how X, Y, and Z would plan out. in the story path system. And so we had some talks with Neil and the rest of the team, and after time, story path system developed. So when I came into Onyx Path as full-time in-house developer a couple of years ago, one of the first things Rich asked me to do was to kind of take stewardship of the story path system games as a whole. Not necessarily acting as a quote-unquote line developer, because we already had Neil for Scion, we had Ian as the overall steward of Trinity, we had Danielle for core, and for our systems we had John Sneed for Aeon. So it wasn't necessarily being the creative throughput on those games, but rather someone to look at the story path system as a whole and saying, is this hanging together? When we make changes, do those changes make sense for the distinct games? Does this still feel like a cohesive system? And then also to start to refine it, which then I went on to do, and I worked with Matthew Dawkins to refine it for They Came From Meet the Sea, and of course I did my own refinement when I worked directly on Dystopia Rising. So I am now kind of more or less looking over the story path system. I'm building together a document so that as we make more story path games, they all feel like they're of a piece, even if they have to make their own tweaks to make them appropriate to their own games. So I've been more heavily involved with Trinity in the past couple of years.
Cool. And so I guess to get a little bit into the biography, for lack of a better term, of the story path system, this really had kind of its base roots, if I'm following correctly, right around the time of the acquisition of the Trinity property. Mm-hmm. And so they've been building, because I recall, I want to say it was midwinter, like 2-3 years ago, I think I was there, and there was a panel where you were discussing with Neil, like just the basics of story path, and I think the first system preview was still about to come out at that time. Right. Mm-hmm. And I remember being very intrigued with it, and it sounded very cool from a conceptual level. And it seems, if my horribly reliable and near perfect memory is anything to go on, it seems like those core concepts have stayed basically intact from jump. Is that about right?
There were a lot of things that Rich wanted to make sure the system was doing. Big one is like, how do we make this game scale appropriately without requiring buckets of dice? How can we make this feel similar to people who have played storyteller and storytelling system games? It has to still use 10-sided dice. It still has to use dots. Has to use 1 to 5 and 1 to 10 scales in general. So a lot of those were kind of static. And then on top of that was a strong desire from the original design team. And then when Neil came on board, Neil as well kind of championed the idea of bringing modern design into this, getting close to 20, 25-year-old system by this point. Right. At the time, the storyteller system was innovative and exciting in X91. Now it's not. So are there new ways that we can push it further? And it led to some interesting discussions about quote unquote traditional or trad design versus indie design. And I find a lot of those line drawing distinctions to be arbitrary and based on a lot of decisions that had nothing to do with the needs of the game. But that being said, we didn't want to make a game that could do a lot of different game styles. Although we have generally come to the consensus that StoryPath is primarily about playing exceptional people. I mean, the way the game is structured, player characters are always going to be, even in dark games like Dystopia Rising, it's still going to be a cut above. That's just the way the game is built. And so, I mean, you can use it for horror. We can do that, but it requires a little bit of tweaking and modifying to get it into that area if we really wanted to go that route, and that's, and like, for example, Trinity or with our Scion, Chris Spivey is doing a Cthulhu-based game for Scion, and he's going to tweak the rules to kind of get to that a bit more. But core StoryPath out of the box is a little more action adventure. You're just slightly better, slightly more attractive, slightly whatever above everybody else.
You're this much more than humanity at the beginning, and then depending on where you go with it, building up. Well, and I guess that leads me to a couple of interesting, broader story path questions. Then we'll delve a little bit closer uh, into Trinity specifically. The core story path system, like when you pull away all of your bells and whistles,
Hmm.
uh, does operate. It seems to me, anyway, as someone who has worked on precisely one community content project for StoryPath, literally like 3 weeks ago. Um, so, from taking it basically from a player or story guide perspective,
Hmm.
it seems to me like if you strip all the bells and whistles away and you're operating at the starting base level of scale, um, you can play kind of just an average Joe. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe a step above average, but basically an average person. And I think if you attack that, one of the things that I love about engaging with it, um, though we will, I'm sure, get into a little bit of discussion on, is how the scale mechanic can give you the opportunity to have a meaningful interaction to a degree with someone who is that much more frightening. And I would think that that could lend itself very well to horror.
That's fair. The big things are, and to be clear, and when I'm saying story best, I'm talking about the entire package. If you take chunks of it out, then you're right, you can get closer to that. The fact that we have concepts like momentum. For those who don't know, momentum is whenever you fail a roll, you generate points called momentum, which you can then spend down the line to activate skill tricks or to get more dice to your rolls. So that means that if you fail early on, you're going to become more competent down the road.
Right.
Another thing is by streamlining a little bit to a degree skills, by having less skills available, that implies a certain amount of larger competence. So people in default story path are generally more competent than they would be otherwise, because they just have less. They have points to spend in less areas, and so therefore they're just generally be more useful.
Gotcha.
That being said, absolutely right. If we take momentum out of the picture or restructure that, if we reduce the amount of dots you give to people, tweak a couple things, it's pretty easy to get story path to a horror-like setting. I mean, it's not impossible at all. It's just out of the box the way we've designed it. The two games we initially designed it for were games where you're playing the child of a god, which is by
Right.
default slightly above average, and Trinity Continuum Core both was talents, which were originally devised from Daredevils in Adventure. So again, it's your Doc Savages, your Shadows, people who are cut above the norm. So out of the box, story path definitely just hit that route. But yeah, I mean, much this way, I tweaked it a little bit for DR, but even Dystopia Rising, those characters are cut above because you managed to survive the apocalypse. You're a bit tougher than normal.
Right. You're
Um,
not. You're
yeah,
not.
you're not a schmuck. You know?
Right. You're not the average accountant that never goes to a gym and just kind of works their 40 and then goes home and watches TV. You're a
Right,
little more than that.
exactly. So I changed some things, and I made it a little grittier. But still, there's that tone there. I mean, again, it's not impossible. But as part of what I'm doing is I need to kind of shepherd the system. So when people are making changes, I'm able to articulate to designers, if you make this change, here's how that's going to play out. Here's where that's going to go. Here's how that's going to knock on effect. So if you wanted to play something that was grittier in tone, we would have to talk about how you would design that way and how that would look and how that would work. But again, for Trinity, it does have a lot of sliding tone. I mean, Aeon is just totally very different from Aberrant, which is totally very different from games like which could Adventure eventually do that game. But the default setting is you're a cut above, so we
Right.
had to make sure that that base was there.
Right. That makes sense. And I think it touches on an interesting, just general design approach too. As you know, I'm a I'm a big nerd for like I, design philosophy. I guess
Mhm.
makes just
Oh yeah.
a it's what I do, but b I just even if it's a game that I'm never gonna run or play or engage with in any sort of day to day fashion, I love looking at RPG books just to see like what made them decide to go this route.
Oh
You know
yeah,
what I mean
totally.
with
Like
their
I'm the
design
same way. I
stuff.
have hundreds of games, 90% of which I will never run. But you're right. It's why to make that decision. How does that play at the table? What does it do to your setting when you implement that kind of change? Certainly, that was a lot of when we're off topic a little bit, but that's one of the reasons why I made Pugmire the way I did, is because I wanted to take D&D and say, how much of D&D can I keep? But I need to hit a certain tone. Like murdering monsters and taking their pocket change is not totally where I want Pugmire to go. So how do I change things to hit that thing? So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I also love to kind of see both games that are great at this and also games that are terrible. I mean, games that just are not good. Say, okay, where did they fail? How would I fix that? How would I change that to get the tone that I think is more appropriate for that game?
Right. Why doesn't this work? Why doesn't to pick on a probably often too maligned system? Why doesn't D&D Fourth Edition feel like D&D? That sort of a, you know what I mean? Like,
I'm a fourth edition apologist, so
right. But well, and here's the qualifier for that. D&D Fourth Edition, if you strip away that mentality, the kill monsters, take their pocket change, this is what I'm used to interacting with, my expectations when I sit down at a D&D table. If you stripped those away and you just sit down and engage with that system, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the way it functions. It's actually quite fun, and it's very simple to run and play. But I think the reason why it caught the flack it did was because it didn't feel like a D&D experience. Right. You see what I'm saying?
And a lot of that had almost nothing to do with the design of the game. A lot of it was they reframed it because I don't know what the ideas were at the time, but if I had to guess, I suspect a lot of the impetus of fourth edition was we want to make a system that can more easily be leveraged and licensed into making video games.
Right.
Because Hasbro is a multimedia company, and they license a lot of people, and licensed D&D video games have always been a good source of money for 30 years now. So I can see the brief we want, and also not only do we want to make this more understandable to our video game side partners, but also people who have never played D&D. If we use video game style language or video game style focusing, we may be able to get them into D&D. So you're right. The under engine of fourth edition is really not bad at all. In fact, I've argued that of all the editions, fourth edition is the most balanced in terms of making encounters. And every player knows they have something to do at certain times, and it's very clear what they can do. But the core of D&D is really at some level of resource management. Right. And if everyone has the exact same resources, then that piece goes away. And that's something that's not easy to articulate if you aren't really digging deep into this. So I mean, I continue to enjoy fourth edition. I played a 3-year campaign of fourth edition. We had a blast with it. I'm also enjoying fifth edition, and there are other editions I've played every now and then. So I mean, if you look at each of those in a certain way, you have to dig into what is really resonating with people, and sometimes there's weird answers. I mean, to bring it back to our games, when I worked on Vampire 20th Anniversary Edition, Justin and I originally had more or less gotten rid of botches.
Right.
We went with something that was much closer to the way Chronicles of Darkness does botches, so it's much harder to botch. Because mathematically, the more dice you have, it's actually slightly easier to botch at certain dice breaks. And Justin was very clear about that during the open developments of this at the time. It was like, and a lot of people came back and said, we love that. To us, that is part of Vampire the Masquerade, is the fact that you can get clown shoes and just really bork things up for no good reason. And it's like, we would not have called that,
and I think that tickles kind of the gambler section of the brain. You know what I mean? The idea that there is a risk beyond just, I wasn't 100% awesome. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so for an anniversary edition, we definitely want to make people feel like, this is the game I remember playing, not the game that I actually played, right? You're down with 20th anniversary, you go, this is actually the game I played. No, it's not. It's really heavily changed underneath it, but it looks exactly like the game, and it feels like that game, and you clearly edit out all the irritating parts of the original edition of the game. Right. When you make a new edition, like with Story Path or with a new version of Trinity, you have different categories, and so it's like we have to have that connectivity, which Rich was keen on. It's like the dice have to feel the same, the sheets have to look largely equivalent. There has to be a comfort there so people can go, oh, I remember playing this game back in the day. But the how you get to where you're going and what you're doing, we can do a lot more with that. We have done a lot more with that with StoryPath.
Sweet. And so to focus things back on StoryPath and I guess into Trinity, um, so I guess, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here on like timelines and levels of release.
You're wrong.
It'd be that's fair.
Let's get it out there.
Frequently. It'd be fair to say that Scion was kind of the flagship of StoryPath. Would you say that was kind of the proving ground and the testing ground and the launch game for it?
Yeah, and honestly, initially, to be perfectly candid, that led to a couple of problems because Neil was developing StoryPath system and was also developing Scion. So naturally, when he's thinking on StoryPath system, it's going to be thinking in the context of Scion.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily always thinking about the context of Trinity. And that's one of the reasons why we brought Danielle Lauzon on, because we needed someone to be really thinking about Trinity specifically.
Right.
So that led to some really great conversations between the two of them, because she came to it with a fresh perspective and said, okay, have you thought about this? And she would think of things that were Trinity specific, but then would have knock-on effects for Scion.
Right. So you can kind of refine the system on both the core engine on both sides. Kind of.
Right. And then when I came on board, I was, by happenstance, I happened to have been tapped by Matthew Dawkins to write the rules chapter for They Came From Beneath the Sea. And so he gave me the Trinity draft at the time, and I had said, okay, the goal of They Came From Beneath the Sea is to make a lighter, faster, more bonkers version of StoryPath. Right. So it had to be, by cramming things down and also putting a little more randomness back in, it gets the kind of weird edge cases and brings more of the humor in. So by necessity, I had to take some of these detailed concepts and boil them down.
Right.
And then I started talking with Danielle and Neil. I was like, well, here's my rules draft from They Came From the Sea, and both of them are saying, oh, hey, actually, you explained this really well. Blah, blah. And in fact, the idea of spending successes was something that I initially started with They Came From the Sea, is because I was trying to explain how to the original was allocating successes. If you look at the original preview, it talks about allocating successes initially. And I didn't, it was hard for me to wrap my head around how to explain it to people. So I just turned it into, everyone knows how to spend money. So it's like, I get this resource, I can spend these resources, do this and this and this. And that, again, shaped all the games. At least while Scion was the flagship, kind of the first one out the gate, and it set a lot of the tone for what StoryPath ended up being. There was a lot of cross-pollination between at least 3 games, and a lot of design innovation was happening through all of the areas. So there's definitely a point where, now that Scion's out and Trinity is very close to being out, we're seeing more people actually playing and engaging with it. And there's other things we're kind of saying, okay, maybe we could have explained that better, and tweaks and whatnot, But even then, I think the core of a system is extremely solid. And a lot of the nuances and struggles people are having are just small areas of clarification. It's like it does all hang together, it does all make sense. But when you're struggling between developing 3 and eventually 4 games all using the same system and trying to shift pieces between them, sometimes it's not always, sometimes we forget to explain to people who aren't us, oh, by the way, this is what we're talking about, we're saying here,
Right, which is one of the hardest, I think, challenges of making games like this. It's not figuring out how the dice function. It's not figuring out how to tell a compelling story. All that stuff's relatively easy to do. Mm-hmm. It's figuring out how to get what's in your brain into another person's brain and make the same amount of sense to them. That's the real art form here. Everything else is
math. Also, there's different ways you can do that. Like I generally design. I'm a very spare rules writer. I write the rule more or less exactly as I intended. So if I don't mention edge cases, you can't do them because there's nothing in the rules telling you can do that. And I think this ultimately stems from working in video games for so long, because in video games, you can only tell the computer to do exactly the thing you tell it to do.
Right.
And that's bitten me a couple of times, particularly on Pugmire, is because people would come from 5e to Pugmire and assume rules exist in Pugmire that actually aren't written down.
Right.
Because they remember playing them in 5e, or they worked a specific way in 5e, and then they come to Pugmire and say, oh, this is broken. It's like, no, read the rules again, and then read it very carefully. Okay, it makes sense. In retrospect, I probably should have been a little more explanatory, and certainly something I've been working on myself. So, I mean, whereas people like Neo and Danielle really like to kind of explain the concept. It's like, here's the concept, here's what it is. But sometimes explaining the concepts in the right space of the manuscript isn't always where the concept is, where people are looking for it.
Right.
So early drafts don't have an appendix, or don't have an index, don't have a table of contents. It can be really hard and feels like everything's scattered all over the place. But then once it's pulled together, Mike Chaney does his magic, Dixie does her magic, and it becomes much easier to parse. But when you're looking at just Word documents, there's certain tension during Kickstarters where it's like, this thing doesn't make any sense. It's like, it does. Just give it a minute, because they're designing for the eventual book. And once it's in the book, it will make a lot more sense.
Well, and there are some places too where things, you start again engaging StoryPath from the place of much more of like a fan and a player and a story guide than a creative. Just engaging it at the table. There are places where you've got your core engine, and then you've got the whiz bang that you're strapping onto that for your particular setting. In Scion, it's one set of whiz bang, and in Trinity, it's a very different set of whiz bang. And one of the things that I sort of encountered, I guess, would be one way of putting it, and ran into a little bit of speed bumps with, is going from the principal StoryPath thing that I had engaged was Scion Origin. And I pretty much consumed the whole thing. It's a great read. If you haven't picked up Scion Origin yet, go get it. It's awesome. And I pretty much consumed it over the span of like a weekend, and then I wrote the Deicide Compact, which is up at the StoryPath Nexus, which if you haven't picked that up, you should go do that too. So I felt from that reading, I felt it was a pretty clear document. I didn't have any things where I felt like I had a lot of questions or whatever. And then I dove straight into the deep end of, I think it would be fair to say, the most crunchy part of StoryPath to date, which is Aberrant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which by its nature, gonna kind of have to be rules heavy. It's very difficult to.
And to be clear, rules heavy in comparison to a relatively streamlined system. It's not Champions. We're not, this is it's not complicated. It is more detailed because it's a superhero game. We have to cover a lot of different options.
Right. It's not that those options all function in weird and arcane ways. It's just that there's a ton of them.
Right. Exactly.
And there were a couple things that I noticed that I would. That I'd love to drill down on, just in terms of, there appears to be a slight scale difference between Scion and Trinity in general. What fueled the decision to have, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, your base human start at scale 0 in Scion and start at scale 1 in Trinity?
So I don't know the specifics behind that, but the way I understand, hearing back from Neil and Danielle, is that we knew that scale was going to be a bit wonky come Aberrant. At the time we were nailing down scale for Trinity, we had already hired Steve Kenson, and he'd already been talking about Aberrant, and he mentioned wanting to do negative scale. So I think the intent was having scale 1 be the default, then moving up and down from there, is so that we have more options to roll backwards, not going into ludicrous territory. Separately, also, this goes back to the slightly aesthetic thing. Default Trinity characters are they're action heroes, really. I mean, if you look at the core Trinity companions, talents as they're written, they're your James Bonds, your Jack Bauers, blah blah. And so by setting it scale 1, you're already kind of implying, oh hey, I'm just a little bit above, right? I'm not 0, I'm 1.
Right.
Whereas Scion is a journey, it's an arc,
Right.
and you have to start from literally nothing, scale 0, into becoming a god.
Right. You can literally start as the accountant who works there 40 and goes home and watches TV inside.
Right. That won't survive the apocalypse. Right. But you might be the child of a god.
Right. Right.
So I mean, it's one of those things that, like, that's kind of where I think some of the logic was. Each game felt like it needed a slightly different standing point on it. And at the end of the day, I can see why it's a little confusing if you're especially going from one book right to another. But we didn't design these to be a cohesive house system. Like, so you pick up one game and you immediately know absolutely everything, and they're all completely cross compatible. That's not what we intended. Right. Tended closer to like the original storyteller system, in the sense of, if you remember, Vampire the Masquerade, when it first came out, had a humanity mechanic, and then Werewolf the Apocalypse came out, and it's not there at all.
Right. Didn't matter. It wasn't relevant.
Right. So that's really, from the design perspective. From my part, we kind of have gravitated towards Trinity as the most complicated, not complicated, the most intricate variation of a story path. So it's like, it kind of become more or less the default. So it's everything can be modified more or less from Trinity.
Okay.
So even though Scion kind of started the thing, Scion also is telling one story, right? It's the arc from normal human, your origin, all the way to gods. Whereas Trinity has to be space opera and pulp and superheroes and.
Right.
So we had to have a lot of underpinnings to be able to put those whiz bangs, snap them on, as you will, like you say. Whereas Scion can really kind of bring it down and focus it a bit more. So they can make more adjustments. So even though it's weird because Scion did kind of come out first, I think from a design perspective, from a mechanics perspective, we're looking at Trinity's probably kind of the default setting, and then, because that's what I used for DR, and that's what I used for Taking From Me to See.
Right, building out from that Trinity core.
Right. So when we think about, that's probably where we're starting from, is some form of Trinity.
Awesome. Well, I have one more system question, I guess, or discussion point, and then I do want to dive a bit into the Trinity just setting, because I love it, and it's honestly one of my favorite sci-fi settings that's ever been conceived of. So I'm so stoked that it's back. But I also just want to make a note, chat. I see that you have some questions, and I will do my best to get to those the last few minutes of the interview. I'm going to scroll through and take a look. So if you do have a question, go ahead and throw it in the chat, and I'll try to grab a couple of them as we wrap up here in about 20-25 minutes. So in terms of that last system question, I've noticed, particularly on this Kickstarter, on the Aberrant Kickstarter, which is still up. You still have about 4 days, right? Head over.
Yeah, 4 or 5 days, yeah.
Yeah, pick that up on Kickstarter if you haven't, and take a look at the manuscript. But one of the pieces of feedback I've noticed quite a bit, both there and at the table, is requesting a sort of like a scale and tier charts. Mm-hmm. And I know that, I guess, to make this more of a question, what are your thoughts on that approach, and on why maybe that's been shied away from to this point, and how scale and tier interact in story paths in general, but in Trinity in particular?
So I'm going to preface all this by saying is that if people do have comments and concerns about Aberrant, we do have a playtest forum that I'm highly encouraging people to put their thoughts into, because that's going to be the thing that we're going to look at, and we're going to make some decisions based on that. So, I mean, while we anecdotally recognize that scale is something that people have questions about, just going online and comments and saying, well, scale's broken, doesn't really help us. But saying, we have this problem at our table, and then we can look at that along with the 4 or 5 other people who may have mentioned similar scale problems. But that being said, scale is meant to be a very light touch mechanic. Aberrant uses a lot by necessity.
Right.
But scale is not something that's we should be thinking about constantly. And that's where it deviates from tier. Scale is something that at that moment, with that instance, scale becomes relevant. And one example I use from They Came From Beneath the Sea is, 60s monster movies. There's a giant rubber monster stampeding down the street. Military pulls up and they start shooting at the monster.
Right.
The monster has a defense scale of 3. The bullets have a defense scale of 0 in They Came From Beneath the Sea. So because there's 3 differences of scale, bullets bounce off of it. Pew, 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 bounces off because it can't. Bullets don't work. Why won't stop?
Right. Exactly.
You want to get that moment. And then all the soldiers jump into their tank and zoom off. Well, now speed scale. Okay, well that monster's not moving very fast. It's big, but it's not very fast. So now we're comparing speed scales, and well, they're about equivalent. So now we start rolling dice to see if the monster can catch up with the tank or not. It's really meant to be an eyeball mechanic. Right. So to bring it back to, like, say, Aberrant, let's look at Mega Intellect, right? Mega Intellect is an ability that gives you scale for how smart you are.
Right.
And if you're talking Reed Richards' Fantastic Four versus me, right?
Sure.
And we're going to solve a math problem.
Right.
Scale says that there's no way I'm even going to compete. It's like, okay, look at it. It's like I'm scale 1 in Trinity terms. Reed Richards is scale 4, 5, 6, whatever. And it's like, cool, you win.
Right.
I'm going to buy the rolling dice. We can look at that eyeball and go, boom. I don't need to know what Reed Richards' exact IQ calculates out to by having scale 5 or scale 6.
Sure.
All I need to know at the table is he is smarter than me, and he's smarter to a degree to the point that dice will not matter.
Right.
Whereas if Reed Richards and Dr. Doom aren't competing over it, they're at the same scale. So what we do is, okay, they're both at scale 5, great. Take scale off the table now. Now they roll dice as normal.
Right.
This is to avoid things like, okay, so Reed Richards gets 25 dice, Dr. Doom gets 24 dice, and you roll them all. No, it's okay. Now that they're at the same scale, we use dice exactly as written in the game, and we stop worrying about scale. So scale only comes in when we have to compare things. And certain things are not easily quantified. Other things we need to quantify to a little bit of a degree to explain the concept. So when we have like negative size scale, I have to give you, okay, yours the size of an atom, your size of a quark, your size of this, your size of that. That's not meant to be a hard benchmark. You're exactly this size. It's more, okay, from an eyeball perspective, you're about this big. And so when Ant-Man is scale -4 and I'm scale 1, it's like, okay, he's so small I can't possibly see him. Cool, I have all the information I need. We can move on.
Right.
But it's the, okay, from as a player, what does scale -4 means? Oh, you're about the size of an atom. Okay, cool, great. That's all I need to know. So when we do discuss scale, we try to use anecdotal examples rather than hard metrics, because hard metrics are not what we're going for with the scale. We're going for just something that you can eyeball at the table really quickly. The story guy can make his ruling on it. Okay, you guys are about 2 scale difference, so you get +4 enhancement, and you go on.
Right, and that was something when we were running last night. Actually, I think we had a discussion about it. If you're watching this and you haven't checked out the Aberrant actual play, the collateral damage, we did session 0 last Tuesday, session 1 last night. We're doing session 2 this coming Tuesday. So if you have a chance, check those out. They're a lot of fun. But while we were at the table, one of the things we were talking about, I think it might have been while we were making our characters, because when people, particularly with Aberrant, when people are playing superheroes, they want to know what they can lift. They want to know how fast they can move. They want to know these things in some term. And one of the things that I don't know if you're familiar with it. I talked about when I was just a wee lad of 16. I spent a lot of time playing Mayfair's old DC Heroes system.
Yep.
It was built on, one of the things that I loved about that system, because it was really pretty rules light at the end of the day. You had 2 dice and 2 charts, and that was the whole thing. But they had a really cool way of breaking out their benchmarks, because you had these points, attribute points, that basically exponentially doubled as they went up. So having kind of like a range of what that meant. That I felt might be a cool, and in some places like where you mentioned size scale, that's very well broken out in what we have up at the Aberrant Kickstarter right now, right? It tells you size of an atom, size of a, so on and so forth.
Right.
And I
And
think
actually,
that
I'm
might be
familiar
something
with
that people are hungering for, is what it sounds like to me, is my kind of takeaway on it.
Yeah, and actually that's DC Heroes is actually a good example of why that potentially could be a concern, is because in that game, stuff like size and weight and speed are pretty easy to break down to benchmarks, but then how do you quantify someone is twice as smart as somebody else?
Right.
How do you quantify someone twice as charismatic as somebody else? And DC
Right.
Heroes kind of just made stuff up. At a certain point in time, and for their system and their design, that kind of worked, but it did require you to constantly be cost around percentage charts and go, okay, well, this is 24,005 pounds, so you can't lift it.
Right.
And frankly, to be perfectly blunt, Onyx Pad doesn't make those kinds of games.
Right.
We make very narrative, story-driven games. So our goal with scale was something that people can use when they say, okay, these people are not on the same level. How can we quickly check to see what that means for our dice? And that is it.
Right.
But
Because if
that
you're
being said,
operating in the same range, even within, I think it's 2 scale of one another.
yeah,
You still the dice are still at play. There's just modifiers, right? I mean,
right, exactly. I mean, it comes down to the if you look at the traditional most a World Darkness or Chronicle Darkness role playing game, your 3 questions you ask are can I even do that? If yes, do it. If no, you can't. And if you're not sure, you roll dice. Scale is just a way to do that a little more mechanically.
Right.
So it's like, okay, can I shoot the giant monster? Well, I don't know the rules of this world. So I look at scale. Scale tells me, no, I cannot shoot the giant monster. Great. Now I can move on. So it allows us to take concepts that are not easily understood, easily intuitive, and put a number to them. But again, that number is supposed to be used just at the table and move on. Now, all that being said, certainly I want to look at all the data we're going to get from playtesting. I want to talk it over with the team, because there certainly may be value in trying to have a better explanation of how to use that at the table.
Right.
Or we may decide that, okay, some kind of benchmark might be the best way to go. We don't know the answers to that yet. So I'm telling you kind of what the intent was now. That may change as we get towards the final PDF, because I want to see what that data is.
Right.
But I'm not committing one way or the other is. But the initial intent, I know from at least Trinity Core, was I just need to know if I can outrun a sports car. Right, kind of thing.
Makes total sense. And again, I would just like to encourage anybody who's watching this, if you are playing, the Trinity setting, go check out the Aberrant Kickstarter. You can get access to the manuscript for a pledge of $1, right? That's what gets you in the door there, and you'll have access to those feedback links too. We really do incorporate that feedback.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Just speaking from my development experience alone, I know that makes a nice pretty sheet, and I go through line by line and I look at what everybody says. You know what I mean? So that's your best way. If you really want to see something happen in the system and you really want to engage it and find out how it's working, go back that Kickstarter, take a look at it, and give us that feedback.
Right, because that spreadsheet is so much easier as a developer to look at than, okay, that comment was threaded page 4 of this forum thread, or it was put on, was it update 45 or 46 that comment was on the Kickstarter backer, or where was that YouTube comment? By putting it all in one place, we as designers can say, okay, cool, now I'm seeing it, but also I'm seeing it literally right next to other people who have maybe very different concerns. Because I know, like for Pirates of Pugmire, I got a couple of comments that were directly contradictory. Right. It's like, more of this and then less of this. It's like, oh, well, that's probably about right then. I can just delete those both and move on.
The perfect compromise is where everybody walks away a little unhappy, I suppose.
Exactly right. If you're one of those 2 comments, sorry.
Yep. But yeah, and having said that too, like we love you guys. We love everybody who engages with the games. Mm-hmm. But we're not going to be able to track. Oh, obviously it was Rinvinder on Twitch in the Q&A said this, so I remember that 6 weeks later when I'm sitting down to work on my manuscript. We're just not
exactly right.
None of us have mega intelligence, unfortunately.
Exactly. That's why I lost to Reed Richards.
So having said that, now that we've gotten past the nuts and the bolts of it, let's just talk for a minute about the awesomeness that is the Trinity Continuum. for those who don't know this setting, I mean, how do you sum up the Trinity Continuum, and what's it been like to sort of shepherd this? Because again, in my mind, this is one of the best sci-fi settings ever, bar none. Doesn't matter what medium you're talking about. And I know Ian's kind of the story side shepherd, I guess.
Yeah, he's the content lead for it.
But to make that, you're the guy who makes that function ultimately, right? I mean, you're the
yeah. I'm to use movie terms, I'd be the producer.
Right. So, how's that been? And how would you describe Trinity to somebody? You know, what's your elevator pitch, I guess, for Trinity?
Honestly, I mean, I enjoy it. I mean, I've known Ian for a number of years, so it's like it's nice to work with someone you know. I know how passionate he's been about the Trinity Continuum, and frankly, he's got this amazing vision. Every time I have a question about the Continuum, I say, "Hey, what about this?" and he'll have some kind of answer. And usually it's here's what we originally did, here's what I think we should do, here's what we can compromise. I mean, he's really thought this stuff through, and so you have this elaborate, intricate universe that also doesn't feel overwhelming,
right?
Because the way we've built it is a bit like Chronicles of Darkness, since there's a core rulebook, and then there's different settings you can snap into that core rulebook, and the core rulebook is itself playable. So if you want to play modern day, that's Trinity Continuum core rulebook done. You have everything you need. And then each of the settings are going to be somewhere on a continuum of time in general. So Aeon is our far future space opera setting where we've gone off into space and we're exploring, and there's psychics and spaceships and aliens. Aberrant is the kind of 10 minutes in the future, 10 years literally, but I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's near future, but like not cyberpunk near future, just like
right.
Could be tomorrow kind of thing. But that's also our superhero setting. So we have a different tone between them, but the events that ends in Aberrant lead to one possible future that could lead to Aeon.
Right.
One of the things that really intrigued me about Ian's pitch for the Trinity Continuum is that he recognized that games were not moving in a direction where a codified, or I would even say fossilized meta plot is what people are looking for. You know, right. It's like, I have to get this book because it has to go to this. Some people love that, but that's not where the overall trend in games is going. So he definitely looked at it as these are all possibilities. We have a core canon where our games are generally going to connect up if you want to follow them through, but there are lots of variations. And indeed, the core characters' talents, how they work is on a subconscious level, they see all the possibilities in front of them, pick the one that's most advantageous to them, and collapse all the other quantum waveforms to shunt themselves into the reality where they succeeded.
Right.
And so by that logic, and this is the part I really love, every Trinity Chronicle that people play at their table is canon.
Right.
Because that is one of the many possibilities of the continuum. You're playing in one of them right now. So as far as we are concerned, the game you're running is completely canon. It may not be our canon. It may not be Onyx Path's canon.
Right.
But it is one of the variations of the continuum.
It's not the Trinity 616 universe.
Right, exactly. And that's a really good example. So, I mean, we have so many different versions of the Marvel Universe. We all recognize them as Marvel. But they're not all necessarily the default comic universe. And so Trinity kind of plays into that. And I find that weirdly liberating because it's okay, well, then we can't really make, I mean, we can make mistakes, obviously, but I mean, in terms of we can do products that don't fit easily into this overall master plan if we want to, and still explore different elements. Oh, here's an alternative take on something. Here's a different approach to things. Right. And also community content then falls into an interesting lump because then community content are all just their own different versions of the continuum. Right. So make sure that we want to focus those because from a financial perspective, we make sure that people are doing books that we want them to stand behind and support and encourage people to go check out. But on a higher level, if people want to take a slightly different approach, things are a different interpretation on stuff, they theoretically have some of that freedom because all of these things are canon.
Right, so you could make Ultimate tomorrow if you wanted to.
Exactly right.
That's cool. And so, having said that, is there any plan at this point to represent characters that have the ability to shunt between those? Because one of the things, obviously, like canonically, again, I'm operating from older information, so
Sure.
maybe this isn't fair to say, but um, Maxwell Mercer, that was
Yep.
kind of like his jam. He
Yes.
could go anywhere. Uh, Usually, if it would focus on like high quantum or high energy moments, but he could kind of go anywhere, and he could move up and down the continuum, and he could travel to different timelines and whatnot.
That's definitely still a thing in this continuum.
And is that something that will make its way to um, a player-facing mechanic in the
I
current
don't
plan?
I don't know, but also I think at least starts there's nothing stopping anybody else from doing that.
Okay.
I mean, the way we built this is one of the things about this design that I think is clever is in the original games, if I want to play Aeon and if I want to play an Aberrant character, move it to Aeon, um, the default assumptions of Aberrant and the default assumptions of Aeon are not necessarily the same. It goes
Right.
back to what we talked about earlier in terms of each game system has its own approaches and design.
Right.
By making Trinity itself a cohesive game, we can do a couple of things. One of which I really love for Aberrant specifically, is that you can play now talents in Aberrant.
Right.
So you can have your Hawkeyes and your Batmans inside Aberrant. We already have rules for those. It's in the core rulebook. You don't necessarily need to replicate those again.
Right.
But that also means that you can take those. I can take my Aberrant character and then just start playing him in an Aeon game. Now, there are going to be specific rules about Aeon, specific rules for Aberrant that you may have to eyeball them. But again, it goes back to things like scale.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, my Scion is scale, PS Ion for Trinity, is scale 4, but my Aberrant is scale 3. But they're two completely different games. But I also can eyeball it now. I know, okay, well, then I'll just give you +2 enhancement and call it a day and move on. That's another reason why we have this relatively abstract scale thing, is because rather than trying to make all the games line up exactly, it's give an arbitrary benchmark that's extremely fluid, extremely flexible, and allows people to then just say, cool, I'm not going to play my Aberrant character. What happens when he shows up in Aeon?
Beautiful. I love it. That's dope. Well, on that note, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna go ahead and just zip through chat real quick and look at some of these questions that we've got going on here. Are there any, while I'm picking out a question or two, are there any areas that you feel that we didn't really dive into, that anything that we didn't get a chance to touch on that you wanted to focus up on real quick while I'm looking at these?
I think the only other kind of big thing is that we are going to do other Trinity stuff. So we are having conversations about future Trinity products. So Aberrant's not the end of it by any means. And separately, just yesterday, I sent off a draft of an outline to Matthew for the Aberrant Wrestling Kickstarter stretch goal. Because you knew that was going to happen. So we are already talking about what we're now calling international and exclamation point international wrestling entertainment, and how that looks and whatnot, and maybe sneak a little Street Fighter RPG goodness in there. We'll see how it goes.
Oh wow, that's some old school reference right there.
Because one of the things is for those of you who fairly moderately obscure reference, but there is a wrestling show called Lucha Underground, which features very colorful characters fighting in a ring in an abandoned warehouse. And someone at the time mentioned, "Oh, it's basically Street Fighter TV show," and I was like, "Huh." And so then I started looking and realizing that MMA/underground fighting and wrestling in a superhero world would look relatively similar. So we actually kind of are looking to how we could blend those together into, a small book, so we'll have to see how much we can do. But the idea of you're playing Novas that do back alley fights in Paris, kind of things, might be something we can also emulate this book. So
that's awesome. One of the first things I'm noticing as I'm going through chat is a lot of people asking about if we will get an adventure version that will go with current Trinity Continuum.
I don't want to talk about too much about that, but I will say that we've already started discussing adventure, and we already got a developer that we're chatting with about that. We've already got a pitch that we've approved. So adventure is very likely to happen. I can't say when. I don't know who's going to be involved necessarily, but adventure stuff is something I think we're keen to do.
Okay, cool. And I had a question in here. Mishetica, I think is the name, asked about the art style for Aeon, referring to adventure being pulp, Aberrant being superheroes. And they're asking what's Aeon's sort of art style, and what has influenced the art style, I guess, for Aeon?
Honestly, that's more of a Mike Cheney question, to be honest. But if I had to guess, based on the art I've seen for Aeon, it's probably there's been an interesting surge in hard sci-fi novels recently, and the covers and art for event like The Expanse, for example, Altered Carbon shows like that. So I mean, there's been this kind of uptick in hard sci-fi space opera style TV shows and novels and whatnot. So I suspect, if I know Mike, he probably drew some inspiration from those kinds of visuals, that kind of late 2010s space opera look.
Excellent. And so I'm seeing there seems to be a thread here. A couple of our participants a little confused or conflating some of the terminologies.
Okay.
So in terms of like Syads versus Scions, Daredevils versus Talents,
Mm-hmm.
can you clarify that a little bit for somebody who's just engaging from the setting from the onset, or maybe somebody who's still holding on to a bit of first edition
Yeah.
bias, I guess I could say.
Probably the best way to explain all this is that at the end of the day, the Trinity Continuum is a reboot. We are not starting from scratch, obviously. I mean, we have lots of great references in Aeon to the first edition. We're going to have similar references to first edition Aberrant in second edition. We want to respect the games that came before, but when we're redesigning how these things click together, um, at a high level, there's a need to rewrite this stuff, and then because we're now designing things that weren't necessarily meant to be in the same space now be in the same space.
Right.
And separately, in cases like Aberrant, the original first edition Aberrant was set in the far-flung year of 2008. So if you want to do a near future game, gotta start from scratch. And also, I mean, the first Aberrant game was really, a lot of it was about the rise of cable television and reality TV. Second edition, it's much more about the rise of social media.
Right.
Because both of them are based on celebrity, but celebrity means something very different to 2019 than it did in 1998. So along the way, we've clarified and tweaked some terminology. But like when I say talents are equivalent to daredevils, while we haven't designed Adventure fully yet, we're still going to have, talents are going to be, a lot of the talent mechanics are go over, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're off the table of making daredevils our own cool thing for Adventure, right?
Right.
But that might be something we explore. So that might still be called daredevils in Division, but Daredevil is a slightly dated term, so that's why for the modern day game we want talent, because that's something that's a little more modern in sound and feel. But yes, there are going to be some terminology tweaks and changes throughout, but we try to get, like Scion versus Syad, we try to get them as close to what people remember as possible, or at least evocative of what they remember. But yeah, there's going to be, throughout it, you're going to see things that are just different.
And from a system perspective, because of the way scale's built, and again, correct me if I'm telling tales out of school here, you now have a couple of approaches. So if you're in Aberrant, you're running an Aberrant game, you could build a Syad that was using the Aberrant rules. But if you have a copy of Trinity, you can just build yourself a Scion and still use it at the table with no confusion. And I saw one more question, I guess, that I wanted to just make sure I address properly, and I want to make sure I read it right. Because it was about who can reach the highest scale was the nature of the question.
Right now, that's probably going to be Aberrant, because that's in all of the game in the original 3 games. That's kind of how the scale worked. It's like it was Pulp was slightly above human, Aberrant was really high, and then Aeon a step below that. Right. So we're keeping to that very, very high level structure. That doesn't mean that specific characters can't be built to be more powerful than other specific characters in Aberrant. And it doesn't mean that aberrants are always going to win in a fight. I mean, a well-designed proxy in Aeon could do a lot of damage to a lot of aberrants.
Right.
So I dislike. I respect the question, but I dislike them to a certain degree because it implies a certain amount of white room balance. And white room balance is you put two people into a white room and they beat each other to death. Which one wins? Role playing games don't work that way, in my experience. You don't really have those kinds of who would win in a fight things.
Right.
We have a little bit more of that in Aberrant because I think fans love to have Batman versus Superman style discussions.
Right. It's a conceit of the medium. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, but even then, the various different Batman versus Superman fights are all very different based on the environment and the story that's happening around them when they're having those fights.
Right.
So yeah, sure. It's like in a white room in a perfect world, all things being equal, looking at pure numbers, aberrants are going to have higher scale, but that doesn't mean much of anything when actually dice hit the table.
Right, and I think that dovetails nicely too into one of the core sort of mechanical engine conceits of StoryPath, which is the needs of the story are going to who wins in a fight between Batman and Superman. Whoever needs to win that fight, that issue.
Exactly. In Aberrant specifically, it's like if Batman's sitting on a ton of inspiration, which in stories like The Dark Knight Returns he is, he cashes a bunch of inspiration. It gives him a huge benefit. And specifically, talents do have access to a gift, which allows them to temporarily channel scales. So it's the equivalent of Batman has planned. He's prepared for this. He's got his kryptonite glove. Yeah, maybe he can win. So a lot of it depends, like you said, what's happening at the table.
Right. Cool. Well, that brings us. We're officially at noon EDT. I know you've got a lot to get to, Eddie. I don't want to keep you tied up too long.
Got more books to make.
Indeed. I just have a couple of quick things I want to touch base on. Just a reminder. Aberrant is currently on Kickstarter. You got a few days left. Hop in there. Like I said, if you're curious and you just want to check it out, throw in $1 at the Kickstarter. Take a look at the manuscript. If you like what you see, back it for a higher level. If you have concerns, let us know in the feedback form. You can always, it's $1 to have a chance to directly impact what your system is doing. But I think once you get in there and look around at it, you're gonna want to grab some of those really cool incentives that we have at that Kickstarter. So head over there and check that out. I wanted to remind everyone that there is no Onyx Path table at Gen Con. However, if you go to the Indie Press Revolution table or the Studio 2 table, our books are there for sale. You can pick up pretty much everything that's in print right now, I think is basically
everything we put into a print run. So it'd be like Pugmire, Monarchies of Mal, Scion, Origin, Scion Hero, stuff like that.
All that stuff that's in a traditional print run is at those tables. And I think if I recall properly, Indie Press Revolution still has some of the cool special edition stuff available as well. So check those out. You will be able to interact with some of the Onyx Path staff and freelancers at the various panels that we're having. Wow, my brain just stopped working for a second there. The various panels that we're having, those are in the Gen Con schedule. Just find those, come stop by, say hi. I personally will be most of the day. If I'm not at a panel for Onyx Path or with the DMs Guild, I will be in Authors Avenue at table R, which is the Third World Studios table. Come by, say hi, give me a hug, tell me how much you love Scarred Lands. I never get tired of hearing people say Scarred Lands. I loved Scarred Lands back in the day. Well, it's back now, so let's get our Scarred Lands on. And to that end, I also wanted to make sure that I let you know that the Bloodseed 5 ebook is now available in print on demand at Drive-Thru RPG. And something else went print on demand this week, and like a moron.
I think it was Scion Jumpstart.
Scion Jumpstart print on demand as well. So grab those. Thank you, Eddie, for making me look less dumb on the internet. I appreciate it.
And they did help.
And then Eddie, I will talk to you again on Monday. We're doing Pathcast Live, which I am super excited about. I've had now all three of you live in a different capacity on the channel, but I get you all at once on Monday. So
you get to witness our complete lack of preparation live.
It's going to be great. I love it. And I get to I think Dixie, I don't know that we've had any sort of discussion on this, but I think Dixie is under the impression that You're all going to be interviewing me, which will be fun.
We could do that.
It's great. I look forward to it. It's gonna be a riot. You're gonna want to tune in for that. And the broadcast schedule will be up in the pre-roll and post-roll on here. Make sure you follow all of our social media. If you haven't done so, please follow this channel. Help us make our way to affiliate so we can start doing things like variable quality for those folks of you that are on mobile devices. Having affiliate status will make this more accessible to you. It'll also give us cool stuff. People have been asking for chat emotes, things like that. Getting that affiliate will help, so make sure you're following the channel, make sure you got your notifications on, and you're checking us out when we go live. And as soon as we can bring you those extra levels of quality with the affiliate status on the channel, we absolutely will, we assure you. Eddy, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to do this. Chat, thank you all for joining us and for the wonderful questions. And we will talk to you all again on Monday. Have an awesome weekend, folks. Oh, hey, I almost forgot.
Oh.
Saturday night, tomorrow night, Pirates of Bloodwater, 8 p.m. we are hosting on this channel.
Yeah.
Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we are hosting Gauntlet of Spiragos from Roll the Roll. So you can come back here all weekend long and enjoy some Scarred-Lands. We will see you on Monday.
Right.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye. Awkward wave to the pre-roll.